What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Discovering Bob Dylan podcast. We're still here. We're still going. We've reached the 1990s. It's a new decade, a new dawn. Still going. Sticking with Bob Dylan here, despite what critics would have us do, which would be to quit now. This is a rough decade for Bob, at least in the beginning here. Bob's cred that was at least temporarily revived by Oh Mercy, totally gone now in the early 90s as far as the critics go, the people go. It seemed like kind of a mistake. Oh Mercy, just maybe a one last hurrah for old Bob. We listened to Under the Red Sky. We're going to be talking about the album here today. It does not enjoy the sterling reputation that Oh Mercy does, as I believe my intro has made abundantly clear. And I feel like you, Dylan, have intimated multiple times that you really don't like this record. Am I wrong? I think the people all know, but why don't you just come out and say it on the record?
I don't know what would lead you to believe that. I mean, we're talking the 90s here. This is a great decade, all right, for numerous reasons, perhaps none more important than my coming into this world in 1991. Some might say the most significant event of the decade or even all time. Um,
So,
but yeah, as it pertains to Dylan, like you say, kind of a lighter deck. We've only got four studio albums this whole decade. And there's some pretty impactful box sets, live albums, archival releases. We'll touch on those as we go along. But Under the Red Sky, it's an interesting album. Probably in the grand scheme of things, one of his more forgotten about albums, which for me really makes these deep dives and conversations worth having. Highway 61 and Blood on the Tracks have been discussed to death, so let's have some fun with this. One might assume that Bob was having fun with this, like you said, based on the success of his previous record, his work with the Wilburys, all his friends who show up to play on this record. Eric Clapton, Slash, his good friend Slash, of course, uh, George Harrison, Stevie Ray Vaughan. I mean, come on, David Crosby. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about the making of it, or do you just want me to go right in?
let's talk about it because it seems now that we've got to this one. Before I kind of had heard of Under the Red Sky. I'd heard Wiggle Wiggle before. That was really the only song from this album I knew. And I didn't know the story behind it or anything like that. It really makes Oh Mercy seem like just a huge aberration because this kind of feels like a continuation of Knocked Out Loaded Down in the Groove, where he's just like bringing in all these different people to guest. I don't know. It just seems like he still doesn't quite know what he's going for, and that it was kind of Daniel Lanois who saved Oh Mercy and made it more of a, focused piece of art. Because it seems like when Dylan's left to his own devices with maybe some producers that just give him too much rope, he just goes ahead and makes these like bizarre choices all over the place. Surprisingly, this one, this it didn't have quite the horrible reviews that Knocked Out Loaded and Down in the Groove had. So it's not quite on that level. And we can talk a little bit more about that one. But for this, he'd worked in New Orleans with Daniel Lanois for Oh Mercy. It had that kind of nocturnal, like a swampy vibe to it. This one, he decides to just go to Malibu, back to his home, and just record whatever was nearby. It doesn't matter. He chose a very odd pairing for producers. The not brothers, the Wazes that aren't brothers, Don and David Was of Was Not Was, to produce. And I guess it makes a little sense because they had just done Bonnie Raitt's big comeback, and they were kind of hot in that whole bluesy Americana kind of pop, but a little more contemporary sounding world. So Nick of Time was big in '89. I think it won some Grammys in '90. So he wasn't just going back to whoever, himself producing. He was getting some heavy hitters. Like you said, he brought along a ton of his friends. anything you want to add to this little backstory here?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you could make the argument, I guess, that Lanois was, sort of the biggest factor in, his momentary comeback, it seems. And I think the big difference in the matter is the difference of working with a yes man versus a non yes man. Someone like Lanois who comes along and challenges him and says, "Hey man, let's actually hone in on some of these, you know, sounds that we can use today to make it sound modern but still really good and to fit your style. But, let's really focus on your writing. Let's make the soundscapes really fit with your lyrics and let's bring the best out of you." And whereas, bringing in Don and David was here, it kind of just seems like a couple of guys who are excited to be working with Bob Dylan. And, that comes across in, a song like Handy Dandy, which I'll talk about in a little bit, literally uses the Like a Rolling Stone organ line. And, they're letting him record TV Talkin' song because, like, oh, this kind of sounds like the thing that he was doing back on Another Side, or bringing it all back home. And yeah, well, let's bring in Harrison, and let's bring in Elton John. That sounds like it would be fun. Um, it just really shows the difference between the two things, and how that can impact an artist who's still, like you said, sort of at an impasse in his career. Lanois was able to save him, but by changing it up and going to these guys, it brings it right back down. I mean, do you want me to talk about my feelings on the record here?
I don't know if we want to save that for the grand finale or what. I'm sure what I have to say is less interesting than what you have to say.
Okay, tell me what you think.
Okay. Well, I think in theory, the Wuzzes was a good fit for Bob's sound. They managed to update Bonnie Raitt pretty well. Mainstream sounding, kind of 90s sounding. Like it doesn't it's not my preferred production style. It's a little heavy-handed, I think, and everything sounds a little artificial. And I really like Nick of Time. It was in my top five for 89. But yeah, it's heavy-handed on the production side, and it kind of strips away a little bit of Rait's sound for like a modern for 89 production. And this being 1990, obviously the production sucks. Like there's just no way getting around it. It's one of the worst sounding years, I think, in music history. So there's only so much you can do there. And yes, you hit on something, I think, exactly what happened, which was the Wuzzes were like, hey, what if Blonde on Blonde, like what would Blonde on Blonde sound like if it was made in the 90s? So let's take all the things you used to do and just put them on like cheesy bad synths and bad drum sounds and like really artificial guitar sounds. And let's take the spirit of that. And then Bob was like, what if I wrote children's songs? And it kind of mashed it together. And yeah, the fancy 90s technology and recording techniques and the children's rhymes doesn't really hit for me. I think it could sound worse. I think it sounds a bit like Nick of Time, but in a bad way. It's too slick. It's missing soul. And all of these guest stars, like you can tell which song Stevie Ray Vaughan plays on. It's not quite like Down in the Groove. It's not to that level of badness, in my opinion. Because at least you can sort of pick out the guest stars. Like you can kind of, when Bruce Hornsby shows up, you're like, okay, yeah, that kind of sounds like Bruce Hornsby. Like at least you have that. At least they add like somewhat of a personality. You can pick out David Crosby's backing vocals. I don't think I would have known that was Slash on Wiggle Wiggle, because that is just one of the most bizarre pairings, I think, in the history of music. You have George Harrison on Under the Red Sky, Waddy Wachtel, Al Cooper. You got Born in Time has David Crosby on vocal harmonies, Robin Ford from LA Express on guitar, Hornsby on piano. TV Talking Song has Robin Ford and Bruce Hornsby again. 10,000 Men has Stevie Ray and Jimmy Ray Vaughan on guitar, David Lindley on slide guitar. God Knows has the Vaughns again. Handy Dandy has Waddy Wachtel and Jimmy Vaughn and Al Cooper. You got Randy Jackson and Don Was handling the bass, who are, they're great session players. Like these are all really solid dudes playing. And yet, again, none of these songs are just, they're not good. It's as simple as that. Like having the idea of like making children's songs, and they're not like children's songs because they have a point to them. Like they're not just sort of, you know, feel good fables and, little moral stories. Like he kind of weaves in some political and socioeconomic, you know, stuff into it. So it's not like a children's song. It's sort of like rhyming and schemes, children's schemes, children's rhymes, updated for adults, I guess, is what he was going for. But it just doesn't really work because the songs aren't that good. The lyrics are kind of cloying. Wiggle Wiggle is very hokey. There's just overly simple rhymes and silly imagery a lot of the time. I don't like his vocals. I think pretty garbage sounding. He doesn't, sound as old as he did. Like on Oh Mercy, you could kind of get the gruffness and like the Tom Waitsy, like you're getting old now, buddy. It's kind of. But I think he wielded that in an effective way with the songs themselves. Here, he just kind of sounds old and not into it, and that hurts. Like you can't be sort of like, just too laid back and like obviously he doesn't really care that much. And I think it's reflected in the music. I think there's an energy to the backing band that like they're trying to bring something like a little bit of spirit out of Bob. But a song like Unbelievable just comes out so limp as like an angry rocker. And TV Talking Song, really weak lines that I think it's like the opening little stanza. The London, I'd gone out for a walk past a place called Hyde Park where people talk. Like, is that the best you can do now, Bob? 10,000 Men, like you can tell it's the Vaughns playing, but it never rises above that. It's not like a David Bowie Let's Dance where Stevie Ray Vaughan is harnessed and utilized in an interesting way, something you haven't really heard or expected. Like, oh, here's David Bowie doing like a 80s dance song with Stevie Ray Vaughan on guitar. Like that's a cool combination that hadn't been done before. At this point, it just sounds like a Bob Dylan half-ass blues song, and there's some, Stevie Ray Vaughan in the background, not really showing off, just kind of there, kind of like, oh, that's Stevie Ray Vaughan. I know him. Yeah, and handy dandy. The nursery rhyme stuff gets a little old. It's one where you get those shades of 60s Dylan, like, hey, remember when Dylan was good? Like, we're kind of bringing that back. There's some hints of it in the background where you listen to just inane ramblings at this point. Um, yeah, the first time I listened to it, I was like, okay, that's not terrible. Like there's some energy to it. I can hear the guest stars. They're trying. And then the second time, I was like, this is pretty lousy. Like this, I think there's like an immediacy to the album that like without thinking about it, you're like, okay, this isn't the worst stuff. Like this sounds okay. And then when you dig in, it's just pretty lousy stuff. Although interestingly, my Big Bob Dylan book says it's his underrated album. And it had some very nice things to say about it. Robert Christgau gave it an A minus, which was better than he gave Oh Mercy. So whatever was going on back then, it seemed like people didn't hate it quite as much as, Down in the Groove and Knocked Out Loaded, but most people thought it was a step down after Oh Mercy, although I think it charted about the same. And I don't know, maybe that's just the guest stars. Maybe that was people thinking, oh, he's back. Oh Mercy. I'm sure he's just continuing that. So it kind of knocked the shine off of him again after Oh Mercy coming back and being like, "Hey, I'm a major dude again," and this kind of knocks him right back off his perch.
So if you had to pick a favorite song or two on this album, just out of curiosity.
Born in Time, God knows, and I actually don't hate Wiggle Wiggle. I kind of think it's a little bit like ingratiating, just because it's so friggin' weird and it has like this heavy metal guitar from Slash over this just like really bizarre. And our friend Jens played it in this game we used to play in the Discord, and it was for the theme was like a made up TV commercial, like pitch a song as a product, and he picked Wiggle Wiggle for a hula hoop. And I thought that was pretty good. So that was the first time I had heard it. I was like, yeah, I could see this as a sort of like bizarro adult hula hoop kind of product going on. Yeah, Wiggle Wiggle, why not?
Jens is a hero. I think you hit the nail on the head with pretty much everything you said. And it's funny. Um, there's certain albums that, the more you listen to them, the more you appreciate them, the more you kind of dig into them. Even for me, an album like Empire Burlesque, which I don't enjoy, is most likely a bottom five Dylan record for me. Even though I don't think I necessarily like it more every time I listen to it, I think I pick up on something in it every time I listen to it. Like, I guess I never realized that before, and it's interesting, even if I still don't like it very much. Um, this is an interesting record because I've never liked it, and the more I listen to it, the less that I like it. It's not my least favorite album in Bob's catalog, but it might be the one that makes me the angriest because I can empathize with him losing the plot in the 80s and making some bad records because everybody did that. But he found a way out of it. He made a damn good record in Oh Mercy, one that was both critically and commercially acclaimed. He was a part of a beloved new project in the Traveling Wilburys. He was undertaking some pretty successful tours, and he throws all of that good favor out the window with some of the laziest writing that he's ever done, probably the most lifeless vocals that he's ever put to tape. And especially coming off Lanois' work on Oh Mercy, this extremely flat and bland production. And before anyone gets on either of us for dissing the writing and all this, like literally what you said is true. A lot of this album was written for his young daughter, who was, 3, 4 years old when this album was being written and recorded. And that's cute and everything, but you can write for your kids and still come up with better lyrics and melodies than the songs on this record. Bob literally already did it at least once before with Forever Young, which is in a career of like enduring songs, one of his most enduring because it is so prescient. None of these rise anywhere near that level. Most of these songs, at their core, at absolute best, are mediocre and pretty awful at absolute worst. And the bass line is just bad. Um, Far and away, the best written song on the record is Born in Time, which makes sense because it was written during the sessions for a much better album. And I can honestly barely listen to this version knowing how much better the original Oh Mercy outtake is. God Knows is probably the only other song that I'd say is like truly well written. And that's my favorite on the record. Not an all-time Dylan favorite for me, but it stands out as a somewhat inspired track on a otherwise very uninspired record. Like I said, he's trying to do this Bring It All Back Home or another side throwback with TV Talking song, and the results are terrible. The only remotely good thing about Unbelievable is the absolutely hilarious music video with Molly Ringwald and Sally Kirkland, because the song itself sucks. 10,000 Men is terrible, but I did see the only live performance ever of it on November 12th, 2000, at the URI Keeney Gym in Kingston, Rhode Island. My very first concert. I was 9 years old, and I saw Bob's only performance. It 10 years after this album came out, he said, "Let's break out 10,000 Men for the great state of Rhode Island," and never did it again. So that's cool. The song is still bad. And then you've got the infamous Wiggle Wiggle, which has been memed to death at this point by every chronically online Dylan fan. And despite being amused by the fact that the same guy who wrote Visions of Joanna also wrote Wiggle, Wiggle, Wiggle like satin and silk, Wiggle, Wiggle, Wiggle like a pail of milk. I don't find it particularly charming or enjoyable. All of the last four songs that I just talked about are among my least favorite Dylan songs ever. A lot of fans will defend the title track. He actually he's been playing the title track, or he was playing it this last summer. I still don't particularly like it, but it does have a nice arrangement, including killer guitar work from George Harrison, because George doesn't know how to sound bad on guitar. And similarly, Two by Two and Handy Dandy, also not very good songs, but they have a little bit better window dressing on them, I would say, than the rest of the album. And I just still always laugh. They literally brought back Al Cooper for Handy Dandy and just said, "Play the same thing you played on Rolling Stone." And he says, "Sure, why not? I'm too drunk to care." Honestly, my second favorite track on the record is another kind of love it or hate it track within the Dylan community, Cats in the Well, which, like Silvio, I think some of that reputation comes from Bob's insistence on playing it live quite a bit. And I personally have seen some really great versions of Cats in the Well. It's a really great, fun live song, and I think the studio version's pretty fun too, and it's got more pep to it than some of the other upbeat songs on the record. But I really need to grasp to say positive things about this one. And I'm not sure if the monumental disappointment of this album, considering when it was released, can ever be overstated. I wrote in my original review of this record a few years ago that the levels of mediocrity and insignificance that this album attains are actually astounding. And that is a statement I now only half agree with. I stand by how insignificant it is, but I think mediocrity might be too kind a word for a lot of these songs. It is an album that deserves its reputation in my mind, and it's not one that I feel inclined to revisit on a regular basis because usually whenever I revisit it, it just makes me a little angry. And of course, Robert fucking Christgau thought it was a good record. And yeah, I don't know. It might even be the aforementioned Clinton Halen who was defending it in a book as well. There are a few defenders of it. I saw some people in our comment section on YouTube recently saying that they thought this album was underrated and they were hoping that we would defend it. I don't think there's any defending this record. I really don't. I mean, uh, you know, I don't know. I guess the early '90s production for me is a little bit more palatable than the mid '80s horror shows. So, an easier experience to sit through. But I wouldn't make the case that it sounds good. I don't think anyone can make the case that many of these songs are well written. I think you can make the case that God Knows and Born in Time are well written, and then I don't know if you have a soft spot for nursery rhymes, and I guess some of these nursery rhymes are I don't know, I guess Under the Red Sky is better written than Wiggle Wiggle, but at a certain point, who cares? I don't know how you could care about it. It's so disappointing. And like, he had some decent stuff, in our next episode, as we'll talk about kind of what happens in between this album and the next. But uh, just a month or so after this, the second Traveling Wilburys album, entitled Traveling Wilburys Volume 3, comes out. And Bob is actually given a lot of the leads on that record, I think because, if I'm not mistaken, he was about to go out on tour and they said, well, let's have Bob kind of sing a lot of the songs. And then when he's out on tour, we can decide who wants to sing what. They ended up liking what he did, so they kept a lot of them. And there's some decent tunes on that record. It's an overlooked album. It's definitely not as good as the first one, but If You Belong to Me, I think is a really nice song. We know he was writing good stuff. We know he was capable of writing good stuff. But yeah, maybe it was the Lanois factor. Maybe it was just having that person near him to really, really push him. Because this is like borderline unacceptable.
Yeah, I mean, if I was a real Bob Dylan fan, I think I'd probably look at this even more unfavorably than I do. And, I don't have a visceral reaction to it. It just feels like an album that exists. And it feels like really the peak of his mediocrity. I think for me, mediocrity is just like the ultimate descriptor of this album. It's not, I don't find it offensive or like bad or like, I don't feel sorry for Bob after this one. So I do think it is probably on the same level as Empire Burlesque, as far as like, would I listen to this again? And that's pretty much as nice a thing as I can say about it. When I was listening to it, the rhyme schemes kind of get like, oh, come on, man, like that's lame. Like the two by two going through, seven rhyming with heaven and eight and gate and nine and wine and like it's a little childish, but it wasn't like too cringy. I don't know. It sometimes I felt like it worked and then sometimes I didn't. And the playing's professional and the production, it's 1990, so what do you expect? I really just think Bob just vocally phones it in way too much. And yeah, it's just not a record that you would ever want to really explore and go back to because it's very surface level. With a artist like Bob Dylan, like why would you really waste your time with an album like this? I mean, he has so much more to offer. And even if you want to explore like his awkward phase, like go to the 80s for that. If you want to hear him sound out of time, here he just sounds kind of like what he's been doing with some bad 90s production and half-ass songs. Like there's just nothing here. You don't even get like that curio of ooh, Bob and synths. Like, ooh, what could that sound like? Like here it's just like, oh, what if Bob was playing with Stevie Ray Vaughan and he wasn't trying at all?
I think the best argument for revisiting it, if you're a huge Dylan fan, is that you've spent so much time listening to all the great albums in his catalog and then also all the good albums in his catalog and also all the okay albums in his catalog and then you've gone through the bootleg series and the live albums and the other archival releases and you've gone down like the YouTube sort of bootleg hole and you've done all this stuff and then before you know it, it's been 2 or 3 years since you listened to Under the Red Sky and you're like, oh well, I guess it's been a minute. I should listen to that one. And then you listen to it and you realize it's still Under the Red Sky. It hasn't changed. It's funny. I talked so much over the last however many episodes where I hammered it home. I don't know how many times that my least favorite vocal era was 78 to 88. And I always think of it like that because, it's starting on Street Legals where I'm like, this is the first time where I'm not really loving how he sounds. And then Oh Mercy is when he breaks out of it. He is starting to embrace this new voice. And I would still say that's my least favorite vocal era. But even with that, I think this album coming after Oh Mercy, this has to be my least favorite vocal album of his. I mean, just you hear, listen to his voice at the beginning of 10,000 Men and tell me that is not the voice of someone who is completely checked out, uninterested. There's absolutely nothing there. Um, yeah, it's a very and also like you said, I thought it was a good point. You don't really feel sad for him in the same way that you do listening to Knocked Out, Loaded, and Down to the Groove because you're like, oh, poor Bob. How does he not know? But now you know that he knows better because he just showed you that he does. So you don't feel bad for him. It is more so of an anger, like the fuck, dude. Come on. Like it's not cool. It's not cool. But it does get better. I'm gonna be interested to see, if if I was doing this show with another massive Dylan fan, I might suggest doing our next episode on the massive box set that comes out the next year in 1991, the introduction of the bootleg series, volumes 1 through 3, rare and unreleased, 1961 to 1991. I'm not going to force you to dissect a 3 CD box set because I'm a very gracious person. And because we've already talked about quite a few songs that were initially released on it, including Blind Willie McTell. So we're going to continue on with the studio albums, and I'm actually very excited to talk about these next two albums, Good As I've Been to You from 1992 and World Gone Wrong in 1993, which I'm going to suggest we do another supersized one big episode on. Um, I have absolutely no idea or expectations for what you'll think of these records, but I think it will be an interesting conversation. Um, as I'm sure you know, and if you don't know, I'm about to reveal it to you right now. These are the first two all acoustic albums that he's released since 1964. I guess the common term that people would use is, his back to basics records, returning to his roots, that kind of thing. So what I'll tell you to keep in mind when listening to these albums is exactly what that means. What does it mean for Bob Dylan in the early 90s to get back to his roots after the last decade that he had made of music, and even after the last 25 to 30 years of making music? So I have a lot of thoughts on them, but I'm interested to see what yours are.
Well, I have zero experience with both of them. I don't think I even knew of their existence. I guess I'd heard of World Gone Wrong, but I'd never heard of Good As I've Been to You. You could have said that was by anybody. No idea. No idea it was from 92. Didn't really even have a clue that he had two albums in the early 90s, up against grunge and everything that's going on in the music world. Here's Bob Dylan. Hey, I'm going back to my roots. Showed up in boots, some acoustic guitars.
Here we go.
Yeah. So that will be interesting. I have no expectations either. I might hate them. I don't think they're very critically beloved, so could go either way. That doesn't really mean much to me. But those are the last two before sort of the revival, the Bob Dylan revival again for the 12th time, the comeback
The
again.
revival in earnest.
Yeah, which
Uh,
continues to this day, really. So we got two more. That'll be next episode. We'll be listening to Good As I've Been to You and World Gone Wrong, the acoustic albums from Bob Dylan. That'll be interesting. It'll be fun. What do you think of Under the Red Sky? Got it right that time. Uh, does it need a revision of its standing in Bob Dylan's discography, in the history of music? Dylan says nay. I wouldn't recommend it, but you may think differently. Leave your thoughts in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Check out description, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Patreon. Come be a patron, join our Discord. We're there, we're talking, we're having fun. And get listening. Good As I've Been to You, World Gone Wrong. Next time here on the Discovering Bob Dylan podcast. See you then.
Nailed it.
Whoop,
Fucking
the opening
pros.
was rough, but the closing was sweet.